All right, so um, we're going to unpack this whole China-India thing.
Yeah.
You sent over some really interesting articles and research about, how China's export restrictions are like impacting India's ambitions.
Hmm.
Their economic ambitions. We hear so much about India's rise and all, but this adds a whole other, layer to it. I'm really curious to dive in and see what's really going on beneath the surface here.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot more nuanced than it might seem,
Yeah.
at first glance.
Yeah.
What's really interesting here is how these export restrictions are, targeted at very specific industries. And it's not just about, protecting their own companies.
Right.
For example, the restrictions on components that are used in like electric vehicle batteries,
Yeah.
they're hitting India really hard because they were relying so heavily on Chinese companies like BYD to, build up their own EV industry.
So it's not even just about like competition. It's more about like controlling the whole supply chain.
Right.
That's a pretty bold move.
Yeah.
I actually just read that India is like projected to have the largest population in the world soon.
Oh, wow.
So like imagine if they could actually get their own production going, like the potential market for electric vehicles there.
It's
Oh, my mind's
absolutely.
back.
That's a massive market. And
Yeah.
and China does not want to lose out on that.
Right.
And you see that in other areas too, like the restrictions they put on polysilicon,
Okay.
which is, a key material for solar panels.
Right.
That also shows how strategic China is being. Because India has these ambitious goals for renewable energy. And by like limiting access to these essential components,
Yeah.
China is kind of hindering their progress and potentially creating a market for, their own solar company.
Yeah. It's starting to feel a little bit like a chess game,
Yeah,
where each side is like making these calculated moves to try and like gain an advantage.
exactly.
But if India was banking on becoming like this manufacturing powerhouse,
Mm.
aren't these restrictions like a major setback?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They definitely expose this vulnerability in India's economic strategy. There's been so much talk about India becoming the next world's factory, attracting companies like Foxconn to move production from China.
Mm-hmm.
But, when those companies can't even get the the specialized equipment they need to manufacture things like iPhones,
Yeah.
the narrative kind of falls apart a little bit.
So like for someone like me, you know, maybe planning to buy a new phone soon,
Mhm.
could this actually mean like higher prices because of these restrictions?
Yeah, it's definitely a possibility. The restrictions are creating these bottlenecks in the supply chain,
Right.
and that can drive up costs.
Yeah.
Now, India is not just, sitting around doing nothing.
Right.
They're looking at ways to diversify their suppliers, but breaking free from that dependence on China is going to take time and a lot of investment.
It sounds like India might have gotten a little ahead of itself with all this hype about, how great their economy is doing.
Yeah. Well, there's definitely a gap between the narrative and the reality on the ground. While India's digital economy has grown really rapidly,
Yeah.
its manufacturing capabilities haven't kept pace.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to, understand what we mean when we say digital economy in this context. It's not just about having a lot of people online. It's about the infrastructure,
Right.
the technology, and the industries that support all that online activity,
Yeah.
much of which India still relies on China for.
Okay, so we're starting to see how these restrictions actually work, but I'm still kind of wondering about China's motivations here.
Yeah.
Like, are they just focused on like keeping India down, or are there other factors at play?
Right.
Yeah, it seems kind of counterintuitive, right? Like, wouldn't China actually benefit from a wealthier India that could buy more of their stuff?
Well, it's a bit more complicated than that,
Yeah.
China's got its own, economic anxieties and challenges that they're dealing with.
Mhm.
They see India's growth, especially in areas like tech and manufacturing, as a potential threat in the long run to their dominance.
Right.
And it goes beyond just the pure economics of it. There's geopolitical stuff too.
Right.
A stronger India could challenge China's influence in the region and even, their territorial claims along that shared border they have.
So it's like a double whammy then, like economic rivalry, but then
Yeah.
also political tension.
Exactly.
So what are India's options at this point? Can they just find other suppliers and like move on?
It's not quite that simple.
Okay.
They are actively trying to find other sources for their supply chains,
Mm-hmm.
but building up their own domestic manufacturing takes time,
Right.
expertise, and a whole lot of investment.
Yeah.
Think about the semiconductor industry, for example.
Okay.
Setting up those advanced chip fabrication plants, the fabs,
Yeah.
that takes billions of dollars and years of planning.
Wow.
India's trying to get foreign investment in this area, but they're starting way behind.
So it's not just about like money, it's also about having the infrastructure and people with the right skills too.
Yeah, exactly.
This is all starting to sound kind of bleak for India.
Yeah.
I'm starting to get why those articles you sent talked about the paper tiger analogy. Is that a fair way to look at it?
I think that might be a bit oversimplified.
Okay.
While India definitely has real challenges to deal with, there's also a ton of resilience there and that entrepreneurial spirit,
Right.
This situation could actually be what pushes them to innovate more and invest in their own homegrown solutions.
Oh, interesting.
For example, we're already seeing Indian companies working on their own EV battery tech and looking at different materials for solar panels.
So this could actually push India to be more self-reliant in the long run.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. Adversity often leads to innovation.
Mhm.
And don't forget, India's got this massive domestic market.
Right.
If they can successfully develop their own technology and manufacturing, they could really reduce their dependence on China and even become a competitor on the global stage.
It's wild how this whole thing kind of flips the script, Instead of India overtaking China, they might be forced to go their own way completely. What does this mean for like the average person in India though? Are they even aware of all this stuff?
There's definitely a growing awareness that they need to be more economically independent.
Okay.
But, public perception is also being shaped by all this nationalistic rhetoric
Right.
that often downplays these vulnerabilities. It's a complicated picture with a lot of different narratives going on.
And speaking of narratives, one of those articles you sent highlighted how India's government has been really pushing the whole, economic superpower image, almost like it's a PR campaign. Could you talk a bit more about that?
Sure. The Indian government has put a lot of effort into projecting this image of India as a rising economic superpower,
Right.
a land of opportunity for foreign investment.
Yeah.
And to be fair, there is some truth to that. India has had some pretty significant economic growth in recent years. But this narrative,
Right.
it's carefully crafted,
Yeah.
and it sometimes hides those underlying challenges and dependencies that we've been talking about.
So it's not necessarily like false information, but maybe a little too optimistic or even misleading on purpose?
Maybe. It's important to remember that governments often use these kinds of strategic communication, to shape how the public thinks and to attract investment.
Yeah.
And in India's case, this narrative of strength and potential,
Right.
it's been really successful at generating excitement and getting that foreign capital.
Okay, so there's definitely more to the story than what we see on the surface. This reminds me of what you said earlier about how this situation shows how important critical thinking is. What did you mean by that?
I think it's really crucial to look beyond just the headlines and those simplified stories that we often see,
Yeah.
In this case, we see how easy it is for a story about India's economic rise to kind of hide the complex realities of global trade, political tensions, and tech dependencies.
Yeah.
It's a reminder to question what we assume to be true, to dig deeper, and to consider different perspectives.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the hype, especially when it seems like everyone's saying the same thing.
Exactly.
But like we've seen with India, the truth is often way more complicated.
Absolutely. And that applies to so many other things beyond geopolitics and economics,
Right.
whether it's a news story, a scientific claim,
Yeah.
or even a marketing campaign. The ability to think critically and separate fact from fiction,
Yeah.
it's more important than ever in this world where we're constantly bombarded with information.
So it's not just about China and India, it's about how we approach information in general and how we form our own understanding of the world.
Exactly.
That's a really valuable takeaway for our listeners. Now, shifting gears a bit, I'm curious to look at the specific impact of these restrictions on one of India's key industries, the electric vehicle sector. Let's dive into that next. So you mentioned that China's restrictions on those components for EV batteries, they're like really hurting India. Can you like paint a picture of what that actually looks like, on the ground?
Okay, so imagine like you're an entrepreneur in India and you've got this dream of building like the next big electric scooter company.
Okay.
You've got the funding, you've got a talented team, you're ready to launch your, innovative designs.
Yeah.
And then bam, suddenly you can't get the batteries you need, like the good quality lithium-ion batteries.
Right.
Not at a price that makes sense anyway, because China has put restrictions on those key components.
Oh.
That just like throws a wrench in your whole plan.
Yeah.
You have to delay your launch, maybe compromise on the quality or scramble to find other suppliers, which is going to cost you more money and take more time.
So it's not even just the big companies like Foxconn. This is impacting, it's like stifling innovation and the small startups too.
Exactly.
What happens to India in the long run if they can't, fix this?
The consequences are pretty big.
Yeah.
India has these goals, to make their transportation sector electric.
Mhm.
They're aiming for 30% electric vehicle adoption by 2030.
Ambitious.
But if they have to keep relying on China for these essential parts, those targets are going to be really hard to hit.
Yeah.
And it also undermines their efforts to be a leader in the global EV market,
Right.
They risk just becoming a consumer of Chinese tech instead of producing their own.
It's almost like they're playing catch up, but the rules keep changing on them.
Yeah.
But we talked about how India is also trying to break free from this. What are some of the things they're doing?
One approach is focusing on making those EV components themselves domestically.
Okay.
The government's offering incentives to attract investment in battery production.
Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing Indian companies teaming up with research institutions to
Oh.
develop new battery tech.
So they're trying to innovate.
Yeah, and another strategy is diversifying their supply chains, looking beyond China to places like Japan and South Korea for components.
Okay, so it's like a multi-pronged approach then. Build up your own industries, but also find new partners.
Right.
Sounds like a huge task. What are some of the roadblocks they might run into?
One big one is getting the expertise and the investment they need to build a strong EV ecosystem.
Yeah.
Making those advanced battery factories takes a lot of money and technical know-how.
Right.
They also need to invest in training and upskilling their workforce to keep up with this industry that's constantly evolving. And then there's the issue of raw materials.
Oh, right.
India has some of the minerals they need, but they still rely on imports for others,
Yeah.
which creates another vulnerability.
So no easy solutions here.
Yeah.
But it's kind of interesting how this whole situation is forcing India to rethink their economic strategy
Yeah.
and their priorities, like a forced evolution almost.
I think that's a really good way to put it. China's actions have shown how risky it is to depend on just one country for these critical technologies.
Yeah, great.
It's a wake-up call not just for India, but for any country that wants to be a leader in the 21st century economy. It shows how important it is to be self-reliant, diversify, and invest in innovation.
It's like in this interconnected world, there's so much opportunity, but also so much vulnerability.
Exactly.
And what we see with India is that you need ambition, pragmatism, and you need to be able to adapt
Yeah,
to handle this complicated landscape.
absolutely. And for anyone watching this whole power dynamic play out, it's a reminder that economic strength is not just about GDP numbers or market size.
Right.
It's about building resilience, mastering those key technologies, and securing your place in the global supply chain. Whoever controls the flow of essential goods and tech, that's who has the power in today's world.
This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening. It's amazing how something that seems simple, like export restrictions, can actually turn into this whole web of economic, political, and technological factors.
It's been great breaking this down with you.
Yeah, this is a good one.
I hope this conversation gets our listeners thinking, to look beyond the surface and question those narratives they see not just about India and China, but about anything that shapes our world.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And for our listeners, as you're going through the news and all the information out there, remember to ask those tough questions, challenge those assumptions, and always dig deeper. Until next time, stay curious.